So hello everybody, thank you very much for joining today's lunchtime training session. Today is going to be our final training session for the volumes 10 and volume 11 documents, and it's going to be presented by Andy Bean on LA 105 air quality. I'm just going to run through the introductory slides. If I can get past my technical troubles, there we go. So first of all, just to run through who we're aiming this this presentation at. Hopefully you'll recognise your role on this list, but if you're not one of these roles isn't one of yours, then you're welcome to join anyway. And just generally as part of taking this module and joining this lunchtime session, our aim is that you will gain an understanding of the benefits of the wider approach to environmental assessment, and understanding the specific requirements of the updates to the air quality document, and understanding how the consideration of air quality relates to the delivery of road projects, and how to undertake an assessment of this topic. If you would like to ask any questions throughout this presentation, please use the instant messenger, and there's a number of people on the call, so it just would make life a lot easier, and we can also then record the queries and respond to them outside of the meeting. So I'm sure a lot of you will have sort of understand now how the DMRB is now set up and the language that we now use. But for the benefit of everyone, I think it's useful to make you aware of the information on this slide. So GG 101 is the reference document for all of the DMRB guidance. It uses specific language throughout the document so that it's clear what information we're asking is going to be a requirement and what information is expressed as advice. So as you can see from this list, a must and a shall are both requirements and things that you must be doing as part of the project. The must depicts a statutory or legislative requirement, and a shall is for is a requirement of the overseeing organisation. Not complying with both of these means that you would need to submit a departure. For should and may, these are when this verb form is used, it's advice. So it's there to support the requirement above. And a can is used to introduce notes, and generally they provide it's a short clarification or a statement of fact. So as far as implementation of these standards goes, the GG 101 requires that all standards are implemented as soon as they're published, and where a contract has reached a stage that would result with the exception of where a contract has reached a stage that would result in significant additional expense or delay. So there are a couple of options open to project teams, which are, first of all, just to implement the standard as it stands, or to consider undertaking a sensitivity test to confirm that the new approach to assessment would change the conclusions or sufficiency of the assessment. If this is the case, then you need to have that conversation with your project manager to decide whether the implementation, which approach you will like to take for the implementation of the standard. There is also a requirement generally throughout GG 101 and all of these standards that it is a competent expert must be undertaking the assessment. So they must, and the individual must be able to demonstrate that they have the relevant qualifications and experience to do that role. This is defined within GG 101 and also within specifically within this air quality document. So the environmental assessment and design standards, they're currently situated in volumes 10 and volumes 11, as they always have been. And they're split into sort of three broad areas. There's the assessment and introduction to principles, which is which contains the documents LA 101 to 104, which runs through the general environmental assessment documents, and also LA 120, which is the environmental management plans. Then there's the environmental assessment techniques, which you can see the list here, of which air quality is one of them. And then we have a section for the design documents, which you'll see is a lot shorter than as it was previously in the previous DMRB, where we've consolidated a large number of documents. So today's presentation is just going to be on the LA 105 air quality. So I'm now going to hand over to Andy, and he's going to run through the specifics of the LA 105, beginning with the document structure.
Thanks, Hannah. That's very kind. Let's see if I can take. Oh, goody. Hannah, what side can you see? Because my computer's now just gone a bit mad. That's right.
I can see
Can
the
everybody,
first slide.
All right. I've gone through to document structure on mine now.
Okay, there you go. Yes, it's caught up.
Okay, that's fine. Right, apologies, slightly slow IT issues with House England's computing system, but there we go. Right, I just want to give you a brief overview on the document structure, and then we'll kind of get into the main nub of the changes or the similarities that you'll see within the air quality assessment methodology. So for those people who've yet to have a look at the documents and, you know, that excitement waits, obviously the main body of the report is broken down into the key areas, you know, forward, obviously just gives you a bit of narrative around the reasons and the introduction of the package DMRB. There's a new section where we've set out more clearly the terms and definitions that we use, so you know lots of people will be familiar with air quality management areas, but again it's all there for completeness. The scope I'll come on to in a minute in a slide or two's time, but the real main kind of thrust in the area, key elements, are really around section 3 then, which is the assessment methodology, which we're going to talk through in more detail. There's an element that just provides a bit more further clarity on monitoring, and if I go to the next slide, no, it's not that one. The bit that's missing off that table is there's another section which again provides some further information around the reporting requirements to go into the air quality assessment. So let's push on, further ado, and let's see if we go there. So what is the scope of the DMRB, or the air quality chapter of DMRB now? Hopefully everyone can see that on screen, but for those who can't, or if it's computer's lagging, the whole purpose of DMRB, in essence, is to enable an assessment to be completed looking at the impacts on both human health and biodiversity for motorway and all-purpose trunk road projects, recognising, though, that lots of local authorities also use this as assessment methodology, and it may find commonplace usage in planning applications for housing development and similar. And the assessment methodology allows you to still complete that work in that it sets a similar structure around how to understand the traffic volumes, the traffic flows, and the impacts on air quality. And just a little bit of further context then. So the air quality assessment obviously must consider the EIA, and does the scheme result in a likely significant air quality effect? We've also got the competing risks for air quality in that it must also make a judgment on whether a scheme would affect the UK's ability to comply with the Air Quality Directive in the shortest timescales possible. We need to assess the risk from construction dust and any road traffic activity associated with that. But just to make clear that the decommissioning of a project is not within the bounds of the scope, normally because obviously the decommissioning of a road project could be many, many years hence, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, so it's not within the bounds of an assessment. So this next slide, slide 6 here, just merely provides a very brief summary, just to say that LA 105 really encapsulates both the core of DMRB, which was HA 20707, so the air quality assessment methodology, and the various interim advice notes that Ian's has shown on the screen there that we built up over time. So just for completeness, interim advice note 17012 dealt with future projections of NOx and NO2 concentrations. 174 dealt with significance of air quality effects. 175 dealt with the compliance risk assessments, and then EN 185, which was a joint endeavour between our traffic colleagues, noise, and ourselves, was then all around speed bands and generating the speed band emission rates. All that has been brought together, as we say, is now encapsulated in NLA 105. So let's just talk about really what this presentation is going to look at in terms of the assessment methodology. So there's been some updates to the qualifying criteria for traffic. There's been an approach where we've simplified or provide further guidance on the level of assessment that's required, the updates to speed bands, compliance risk, designated habitats. We've done some further work around construction dust risk assessments, project air quality action plans, and air quality monitoring. And I think before we really get started in earnest, what is fair to say is for those people who've been familiar with DMRB air quality assessment methodology for the last number of years and the associated interim advice notes, picking up LA 105 feels very similar, feels very comforting, because actually the assessment methodology in core is pretty much identical to the work that you would have experienced over the last number of years. There are been some changes, and again, this presentation is just going to walk through those and sort of talk you through the key elements. But what it's not going to do is tell you how to do a DMRB assessment. You know, we're hoping lots of people on this call have some reasonable understanding and appreciation of that work already. Anyway, so let's move on to the first notable change. So the first notable change, when we've looked at updating the air quality chapter, was trying to understand whether the criteria that we had in DMRB historically, the 1,000 vehicle change, etc., whether they were still reasonable or whether we need to make wholesale changes. And what we found through some work that Steve and I did, and unfortunately Steve can't make it today, is that actually the 1,000 vehicles and the 200 HGVs still was a reasonable change, both from an air quality point of view, but really, and this is critical, in having conversations with our traffic colleagues who do all the traffic modelling work that underpins the air quality assessment, they were kind of de minimis numbers that they would support in terms of having a degree of assurity from the outputs from their traffic modelling. We've kept the change in alignment of carriageways broadly similar, because again our modelling assessment showed it, you know, that was a reasonable level. And again, when you start speaking with delivery colleagues, you know, getting certainty on those kind of placement lines, you know, 5 meters is broadly where it's at. The one element that we have changed, and I'll come on to this in a second, is we moved away from the daily average speed change of 10 kph or the peak hour speed change of 20 kilometers an hour, to bring it more into line with the work that we've been covering over the last number of years and brought forward by interim advice note 105, which is speed bands now. So what we're saying is there isn't an average speed and there isn't a peak hour speed change, it's a change in speed bands. And for some assessments that might be at the AADT level where we have notable changes in daily traffic conditions, although it's unlikely, but more where we are starting to look at period flows, then it is quite possible to see changes between, say, congestion to free flow or high speed conditions, and that might be as a function of the scheme. One other area of work that we wanted to cover and bring forward in terms of trying to provide a little bit more clarity is that I often get asked when project teams come forward with schemes, either by the project managers or consultants doing work on behalf of Highways England, should it be a simple or should it be a detailed level of assessment? And I think for many years it seemed to be a culture of rushing towards a detailed level of assessment. But actually there are occasions when a simple level assessment is probably appropriate. And what we've taken the opportunity to do within the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges is provide a little bit of a structure now. So it's not black and white and that you get to one point it's always one thing and it's always another. But just try to illustrate what are the key features of a scheme. You know, so is the scheme a large project with likely to have large changes in traffic conditions, either in the volumes that's being brought onto the network or the area over which they affect? Or is it a small localized junction improvement, if you will? But also against that backdrop, what is the receiving environment? So are we talking about a very large project, but actually it's quite in some rural location where air quality by and large is notably below 40, may even well be below 36 and down to 30. So actually, the likelihood of the schemes having an effect and causing a significant effect or affecting the UK's ability to comply with the Air Quality Directive are fairly minimal. Or are we in an area where there's lots of air quality management areas, government is reporting PCM limit values way in exceedance of the Air Quality Directive, and there's lots of residential properties nearby. So all those factors have been brought together now within the DMRB, and there's a flowchart that articulates this well. And at the end of that, it gives you an outcome of whether you need to ideally do a simple base assessment or a more detailed base assessment. And what we're also doing in the DMRB now is provide some context around that. So obviously if you're in a simple level of assessment, it's around ADT, it's around, much more potentially qualitative, and it's around a proportionate number of receptors. Whereas in your much more detailed level of assessment, it tends to be because we're looking at key features around large scheme with different changes in traffic conditions over the course of the day. We may have a lot of residential properties clear by, or designated habitats, and we need to make sure we do the appropriate level of modelling. So it's a balance. And if we move on then to the next slide. So what other work have we been getting on with? Well, lots of work that we've been doing in the background has all been about research, and one of the key areas of research that we've been promoting over the last 2 years now is all around the use of speed bands and updating the vehicle dynamics and the emissions associated with that. So we've been working very closely with one of the UK leading experts in this field, Dr. Glyn Rees-Tyler, who's been doing some really excellent work in this area, looking at actual driver behaviour. So we've gone away and recorded somewhere in the region of 2,000 hours worth of driving, and former colleagues who used to work with Highways England are very instrumental in supporting that activity, but also engaging with other experts throughout Europe, so in the Netherlands and Austria. And what our work has led us to understand is that previously we had, say, 3 speed bands for motorways, so we had free flow, light congestion, and heavy congestion, and that was based on the knowledge at that time. Is actually we need to bring forward 4 speed bands now for motorways. So this still has the same outcomes for heavy congestion, light congestion, but what we've introduced now is a free flow category which represents speeds at 50 to 60 miles an hour, and we've also introduced high speed, and this represents both the effective driving dynamics, for which we've been able to get a lot more clarity on this, but also the more recent published statistics around drivers on the UK road network from the Department for Transport, where quite a lot of those drivers, somewhere in the region of 50% of cars and vans, drive in excess of 70 miles an hour, with 10% of road users driving in excess of 80 miles an hour. And again, from all our research, we see much more elevated emissions in that space. So we want to at least bring some representation of those much more elevated emissions. Our research also identified the effects of introducing and enforcing the national speed limit, 70 miles an hour, on motorway and dual carriageways, and also 60 miles an hour speed limits for other occasions where high speed has been the prevalent speed during the course of the day. Sorry, excuse me. And all our emissions work in this space has been underpinned and informed by the emission factor toolkit. And the most notable change and variance, if you were to run the emission factor toolkit speed curve, is that certainly during periods of light congestion, our work has clearly demonstrated that actually there's about a 7 to 10% increase in emissions compared to the emissions generated by the emission factor toolkit. And that then is a function of the increased driver dynamics, which in turn leads to increased engine and emission loads. So all this is encaptured in emission factors, and those spreadsheets are available to our suppliers working on schemes on behalf of Highways England. Just to conclude, obviously, that in some of the further refinements for speed bands, again, we've been working on a proportionate application, so I know one of the areas that we had a lot of questions when we first released Interim Advice Note 185 was around, is it every road? Do we need to pivot every road? Well, actually, I think, former colleagues who used to work in the transport planning group have given a lot of thought to this, and really it's about saying focus on the key areas of risk. And from us that, is this likely to be where we've got air quality management areas? Is it around likely to be key junctions, monitored evidence, or the likelihood that, schemes could also bring forward new exceedances or exacerbate existing exceedances, or conversely improve existing poor air quality conditions. One thing that we've had to do, and this is working alongside our transport planning colleagues, is that they're still in the process of coming to an understanding of how to bring forward their guidance on traffic modelling, and to assist, we've provided advice or captured the advice on how to undertake speed pivoting. So this primarily relates to our transport colleagues who we work alongside, both within Housing England and also in the supply chain, the advice on how you undertake speed pivoting. So it's temporarily got a home in LA 105. In the fullness of time, it will go and sit in its own relevant section of guidance and advice sat around traffic modelling. Right, okay, so one of the other areas that we've updated and done some further work around is around compliance risk assessment. So this used to be captioned in Interim Advice Note 175. And some of the kind of notable changes, so rather than talking about lots of work around all the methodology, is working on the assumption that lots of people have an appreciation of Interim Advice Note 175, used it previously. But some of the notable key changes is that we're no longer basing it solely just on the outputs from the PCM model, but actually we're now basing it on the outputs from our air quality modelling work. And this is very much in line with guidance that JACU have issued to those local authorities that have been asked to bring forward plans to help support national compliance. And similarly, work that Housing England is doing elsewhere on its network to support government's plans in this space. Another notable change is it's no longer just about modelling the facade of a house, but the requirements set out in JACU's latest guidance is that we need to model the nearest qualifying feature. And for annual mean nitrogen dioxide now, that can be a public highway, it can be a footpath, a footway, a bridleway, and it can also be the back garden of a property. And it is slightly different to local air quality management duties for local authorities, but that is the guidance and the advice. So now again, it's about modelling those nearing qualifying features. The other advice that we've received from government in this space is that those judgments need to be made within 15 metres of the running lane. We also need to model a point 4 metres from the edge of a running lane, and this allows for a comparison with the work that either local authorities are doing where we're coincident with their studies, or also with the PCM modelling. And there's a section in the new guidance document that talks about aligning and looking at the variance between our modelling and either DEFRA's PCM modelling, or where it's been superseded by local authority work. We need to, or you guys need to also inform Housing England where you model any exceedances that are not covered by a PCM link, and we need to have a think about those and provide you guys some advice. Now, I'm not expecting people to read figure 2.79, but it's mainly just a hook to say actually within the assessment process overall on page 26 of the guidance, there is a clear flow chart that we spent a lot of time, Steve and I, developing to provide a structured approach. And again, as and when you get to this point and working through the guidance, working through that flow chart with that key information around compliance risk allows you to come to a reasonable and balanced view of whether the scheme is likely to affect the UK's ability to comply with the Air Quality Directive. Right. Okay, one of the other big notable changes to an extent is all around judgment for designated habitats. And I know this has been quite a hot topic of late, both with a number of works coming out of Natural England in terms of advice. There's been quite a lot of the European case law, and within sort of the last 6-12 months, the Institute of Air Quality Management have also produced some advice. So what I would say on our guidance is obviously we've developed our guidance in conjunction with Natural England, and those conversations have been happening now for the last 4 or 5 years with different representatives. Overall, the assessment methodology will feel very familiar. So it is still about modelling the impact on receptors. It's still about doing your transects across your designated habitats. The thing to note where we've taken the update is there's now an expansion number of habitats. So, in the past we've talked about sites of special scientific interest, special areas of conservation. We're taking the opportunity to go to the National Policy Statement for National Networks, and in there's a more informed and detailed list, and the assessment methodology now just brings the guidance into line with that listing. We've taken the opportunity to also update the deposition velocities for grasslands and forests, and that brings it in line with the latest published advice by others in this space. We have also taken the time to look around the work on the impact of nitrogen deposition. So there's been a lot of work from Natural England looking at the dose response work, but the bit we've taken and clarified is that actually it's not the air quality specialists' need or responsibility, I should say, to make the judgment of whether the impacts on the designated habitats are significant or not, but actually it is the air quality personnel undertaking the work, the competent expert, to do that job and to provide the advice to their scheme ecologists, and them to come to a view and provide that advice and outcome to inform the overall consequential impacts and judgment of significance for air quality. And that's an important development because, historically, I've been there myself as a consultant and others, you do the work, and we as an air quality specialist try to come to a view around whether we think the change in nitrogen deposition is significant or not. And actually we need to, and it's been clarified through the latest update to the IA regulations, that the relevant competent experts need to make those judgments. But again, what we have done within the guidance document within LA 105, so figure 2.98, again, provided a very simple flowchart. Yes, it is that one, sorry. Flowchart working in partnership with Natural England around how you come to that view. And the way that it works is that it's not a judgment of NOx. NOx is an informative part, and I've taken a lot of time to read through the World Health Organization advice over the last week or two. And when you get in that, who the World Health Organization part is very much about NOx informing and guiding thoughts around nitrogen deposition. But it's going through that process and saying, actually, have I got concentrations above 30 micrograms? Have I got a reasonable change? Is a receiving environment? And working through a process that says, actually, when I look at the levels of nitrogen deposition at the end of this process, I share that information in the round with my scheme ecologist, taking a view, obviously, of Natural England's published work on the dose response to nitrogen impacts to receiving habitats. It is then coming to a balanced judgment, and in using that advice, that received advice from the ecologist, to inform the overall judgment of significance for air quality. Right. One other area that we've also done some work on, and we've had lots of questions over the last number of years, is around construction dust risk assessment. So historically, we've done very much a simplified approach, which was pretty much draw a line 200 meters around a site and just comment on whether there's any key receiving features within that area. And lots of questions that we've had, and again, recognizing that the Institute of Air Quality Management had done some work around this, was trying to provide a judgment and a balanced judgment on how to undertake a construction dust risk assessment without writing hundreds and hundreds of pages, as I've seen in the past, and others, and getting a balanced response. Ultimately, it's for the contractor coming on board to take ownership of construction dust, but we need to provide them with some early advice and obviously the clients. So what we've done now is said, and we'll come over to this on the next page, a little bit of a balanced view on how you come up with a judgment of dust risks. We've moved the construction period actually from 6 months, as previously was in HA 20707, to 2 years, and that represents a more reasonable balance of likely consequential impacts and the ability to influence them, and try to develop some advice around the likely levels of air quality monitoring that may need to be supported for construction dust activity. So let's just have a quick look at the next one. So similar to coming to a judgment on scheme impacts, we talk about large scale schemes. So again, the ability to both potentially generate a lot more dust, but also potentially to generate dust over a lot wider area just from the nature of the size of the scheme, therefore bringing into receiving environments a lot more properties, be that residential, be that designated habitats. But also the distance from the sites, again, are we close to a source, are we some distance away? And what we're saying is, obviously, where you've got large-scale projects with people or receptors fairly close by, then there's a high likelihood. It's not that it will necessarily manifest itself, but there's a high likelihood. And again, we need to then work through developing the reasonable plans. Where we are in a much smaller scale of projects, and some small scale projects can have large dust impacts. For example, construction or breaking up a bridge and reinstalling one could be quite dusty. But it may be very localized. Alternatively, upgrading a junction is unlikely to result in lots and lots of dust activities. And if people are some distance away, they're unlikely to receive a lot of dust, with dust dropping out fairly rapidly. And what we're really trying to say on this is it's a balanced approach, and I think I just saw a comment coming across there. And again, it's not about saying, right, just at one point it's a high construction dust risk for everything, but it's obviously having a balanced approach. It's about focusing on those key areas of high construction intensity, but also those key areas of high receiving environment as well. So for the vast majority of your scheme, it's a smart motorway alongside the side of fields with nobody to receive anything, with some offsets for, say, arable crops, with fairly low levels of intensity of construction activity. We're not talking, masses and masses of construction dust monitoring, and nor should it really be put forward. By the same token, if we've got some fairly intense construction activity around a collection of houses, or as there say, a designated habitat, then we need to make sure that we have got the right level of mitigation in place, that the management plans are reasonable and robust, and that if monitoring is required, then again, it is balanced in that way. Right, just moving on to mitigation and obviously the development of project air quality action plan. So, just coming sort of full circle to our scheme. So let's say we've gone through our scheme impact and found out that we've got some noticeable significant air quality problems. To date, like I say, we've done a lot of research into air quality mitigation measures, myself supported by other members of the team and working along through a supply chain. Some of you on the call may have been involved in some of these projects. Where all our research has led us to is 2 definitive measures, and that's the introduction of 70 and 60 mile an hour speed limits, and obviously they're only effective where you have very high speed conditions, and we're pulling those emissions down to controlled environments, or a 9.5 meter vertical barrier, which is again based on a lot of work we've done with our colleagues in the Netherlands, monitoring behind the barrier, and that showed around about a 5 microgram reduction in annual mean nitrogen dioxide levels within the first 50 meters, dropping down to about 2 micrograms between the next 50 to 200 meters. We have more recently, and my colleagues here in Highways England, been looking at traffic management measures, and again, there may be instances where local traffic management measures, and that might be junction realignment, it might be signal timing, it might be diversion routes, could also bring forward some air quality benefits. But I would suggest that is on a case-by-case basis, and your local transport colleagues would need to look at those, provide some initial advice around the likely changes in traffic flow that might be achieved either through congestion management or traffic rerouting before the opinion and advice on air quality can be developed. Where we do need measures to mitigate air quality exceedances, those need to be captured in an air quality plan for the project. Again, that section's described within the guidance document, and there's advice around the kind of information that needs to be included within any assessment and reporting. Well, good news, everybody. We're nearly there, so on the home run. Air quality monitoring. So again, one of the other areas that we wanted to provide some further clarity on, and lots of questions that myself and colleagues get asked, is around air quality monitoring. So one thing that we've taken the opportunity, and this has come back working alongside our project manager clients, is that there's lots of air quality monitoring went out with no oversight at times. So again, it's just to provide an opportunity within the guidance to say, look, where air quality monitoring is to be proposed, that needs to be shared with House England before any monitoring is done. The likelihood is that will come into the air quality team in House England and we'll provide some advice around that. Where monitoring data is undertaken and approved, then that data needs to be shared back with House England on a quarterly basis. We keep records of all our monitoring data that we undertake, somewhere in the region in excess of 1,000 monitoring locations a year, if not more, and we need a way of managing that. So the advice in LA 105 is that documentation needs to be provided on a quarterly basis. And again, there may be need to undertake air quality monitoring where we brought forward mitigation measures. So some of you may be familiar with the M1 Smart Motorway scheme up in the Sheffield region. That needed air quality mitigation measures, so we introduced monitoring there, similarly with the A556. And again, where monitoring is required in those circumstances, prior to any monitoring being undertaken and commissioned, that work needs to be approved by House England. And again, the likelihood is that the air quality team will provide some advice and commentary on that. Well, there we are. We had a canter, and I forgot the level of excitement and got through that fairly quickly. There's just a further slide there. If you do have some general questions, obviously there's 2 email addresses there to respond to. Hannah, I just wonder, I noticed some comments flitting across the bottom of my screen. Can we get those up and maybe just have a quick walk through, if that would be helpful for colleagues?
Yeah, can you see those? Can you scroll to the top? There's 10 or so, I think, probably.
They're not showing up on my screen, which probably isn't very helpful.
Okay. Yeah, I can read them out if you'd like to.
Oh no, I just got it. Yeah, no. So Paul, so one from Paul. Please read HGV thresholds. Paul, the HGV thresholds, as I was saying, that's based on a lot of conversation with our traffic colleagues. We found no grounds to remove the 200 HGV threshold, so we have kept it as is. And then we got one from Sarah. Again, risk features, I think, Sarah, just picking up your point as to when it came in. You know, nitrogen, well, receiving the habitats there, designated habitats are there, and there is clear advice within LA 105 around the procedural steps working through the NOx concentrations, the 30 microgram standard, and working through to nitrogen dioxide, through to nitrogen deposition, and then the judgment of impacts. I'm just going to the next one. So Hazel, you sent 2 in at that point. So Hazel, I'm just reading both yours at some time. There you go. I think taking your first point, Hazel, around simple and detailed assessments, cost effectiveness is there. One thing we would say is we've seen lots of occasions where people run straight to a detailed air quality model. ADMS is an example of it. And it's not always more cost effective. It may be that actually under a simple detailed assessment, simple assessment, my apologies, what we're really saying is actually we only need to do a representative handful of receptors just to show that the scheme isn't leading to air quality exceedances. I've also seen situations where people claim it's simple assessment, but they've got a detailed dispersion model in the hand and end up modelling all receptors. And again, that's not warranted. Again, very clearly within the guidance, it is only those receptors that are likely to lead to significant effects that we really need to focus on. So it's a balance. And then you say on speed banding, all right, yes. So within the guidance, exit slip roads are, you're right, I think they are free flow from memory. Within the spreadsheet, it clearly articulates this. But what we say for on-slip is they tend to either be light congestion or heavy congestion, not because they're in that state, but because actually it represents people undergoing hard acceleration to get up to speed to join the motorway at 70 miles an hour. Right, a few more. So we've got Josh. Yes, so Josh, just to clarify your question on public access. So the footpath it's a footpath. It could be a cycleway, it could be a bridleway, if you will. It is any footpath that someone could walk along. So it's not a road, and the reason for that is a road is with a feature with which motor vehicles can drive along, and they are excluded from the air quality directive. So it's a footpath where you can have reasonable motorised vehicular access. Can you define, Simon, you've asked me what speed pivoting. It's in Appendix A, Simon, within that, but very basically it's a comparison of observed and model speeds, and where you need to bring the model speeds more into line with the observed. That's the process known as speed pivoting. Victoria, you've asked about. No, I think we're quite content around the judgment on nitrogen deposition, and like I say, when you follow through the World Health Organization, NOx working through, it seems to be, from as far as we can tell, underpinning ultimately a judgment of nitrogen deposition. Hazel, you then asked about the Wealden judgment. Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations both with Natural England, and I actually provided some advice back at the time to the UK legal team looking at this. And really, what I would say is that for Highways England, we actually are doing intrinsically cumulative assessments, in so much that the traffic model is built up of all reasonable likely developments and then also our scheme. I've had some conversations from Natural England, and if you were to take an example of just 10 developments, which over, say, 35 miles of smart motorway upgrade is nothing, if you were to follow through the permutations of all that, you actually would end up doing 3.5 million different modelling combinations, which isn't the purpose or need of Wealden, isn't the purpose or need. So I think it'd only be where, at the end of doing a comparison, the do mean do something, that you're seeing nitrogen depositions likely to bring forward significant air quality effects, that at that point we might need to take a step back and think about some of the permutations. But I would also argue at that point then it's a conversation really with the project management team and Highways England to understand the type of work that's likely to be brought forward. And just going through, Paul, you've been busy whilst I've been talking? Our schemes in Belgium. Yes, so Paul, you're asking there about construction dust. You're right. I mean, obviously, scheme impacts are tend to be more focused over the entire length because it's operational ongoing. Picking up your point about construction dust, you're right. It is temporary in any location, and I think what we're really trying to say is, if you've got a very large scheme likely to be lasting for several years, for example, I can think of the M4 Smart Motorway. It's about making sure that we've got a reasonable balance and understanding. I mean, again, for construction dust, if you're in parts moving along, you'd need to make sure that you've got a reasonable balance and understanding of the likely construction dust impacts at that point. Obviously, if we've got a large-scale impact where we are displacing traffic over, say, 2 or 3 or 4 years, for example, if we've got a large-scale project, obviously that needs to be taken into account. How scale define length as quantum methods? I think it's Paul just picking up. It's a balance. It's a balance in terms of trying to say, right, in this area we've got a fairly large scale project. We've got a lot of people nearby. There is a high likelihood then in some circumstances that we could be causing dust. I think once the contractor's on board, you could have a lot more informed conversation. The work here is just trying to provide a balanced view and also a proportionate view that we don't get pages and pages and pages of dust. But also we can start to guide and inform both our project management team for the scheme, but also our future contractor, the likely dust receiving environment and the people and the work that might need to come forward. So again, it's a balanced and proportionate approach. Concerned of extension nitrogen. I mean, I think, Paul, I'm just reading through your comment now around nitrogen deposition of protected species and habitats. I mean, obviously, we as House England have got to respond to the National Policy Statement for National Networks, and within that, it has set a broader scope. So we've got to make sure that we respond to that, and we certainly have had questions in planning inquiries asking, I think it's about a local nature reserve. I'm doing a bit from memory, so I haven't got the relevant section open in front of me. So I think it's a balance, and I think we just need to understand where that balance is. I think that's the context of the question you're asking me. So apologies, Paul, if I haven't quite got a handle on that. So another one from Sarah. Is the implication? So Sarah, the footpath for compliance is relevant exposure. I think this is what you're asking me. So footpaths now become a relevant qualifying feature for the assessment of compliance risk. So they would need to be considered. So you can get, and we have seen from work that we've done, footpaths within 15 metres of the running lane of a motorway. They don't cover features that run perpendicular, so that's over bridges and tunnels that go under a motorway, if you will. But it does also cover footpaths that run alongside urban roads, if you will. James, you've asked about regional ARN. So that's now covered in the, gosh, what's the name of this? Is it the greenhouse gases, the carbon chapter? And the reason, James, we removed the regional element from DMRB was, or the air quality chapter, it wasn't used to make any judgment of anything. We knew these values of carbon were going up, or NOx emissions, but in no way did it inform a decision-making process. So we've informed it as a much more streamlined process. I mean, obviously, WebTag, that's DFT's appraisal methodology, and you'll need to follow the advice in that. It should be that the vast majority of information that you've run for LA 105, similarly as it was in the past, will inform your WebTag assessments. Good, there we go. So Paul Wilden, I don't know what to say. Maybe you and I can have a conversation about design agents. I can't respond to that at the minute because I don't quite fully understand the question and the context. So, Paul, if you and I speak about that later, and then through Hannah, we could push back a bit of clarity on that for everybody else's benefits. Again, Josh, just picking up the point. I mean, again, we only respond to the policy requirements set out by government and national policy statements. I think what we have to do in these circumstances is do what is reasonable and proportionate. I mean, I think if there are areas that are more challenging to garner some information on, then I think we need to understand that. I mean, obviously, lots of background sites and information can be obtained from APIS, and I think it's a reasonable balance in this. And I think it may be a case that as we work through some assessments following the new advice, if that then becomes a real challenge, obviously we can go back to government and have those conversations in respect to the national policy statement at that point. Right. Gosh, I keep talking and people keep throwing in questions. Habitat search. I believe Natural England have agreed to 2 kilometres. I can't comment on that, Sarah. I don't know if there's a specific project. I mean, all I can say is from an air quality point of view, we only need to limit it to within 200 metres, and that hasn't changed. It may be that there are other consequences for looking at habitats, possibly for biodiversity, I don't know, breeding birds, for example, or back foraging habitats, if you will. But certainly for air quality, we only need to limit it to 200 metres of the road. Resites across the end, that is okay, just the could be. Cool, that's fine. So, Vicky, you've asked about PM 2.5. I think, Vicky, to be absolutely clear, in WebTag, it says PM 10 or PM 2.5, not explicitly. Steve and I have also been given a lot of thought on this, so we'll give some further clarity around that as well. I mean, the reason we haven't included it in DMRV is because when we look at PM 2.5 across the UK against the advice set out in the Air Quality Directive, we don't see any exceedances anywhere alongside the motorway network and trunk road network for either PM10 or PM 2.5. And I think at the last looking at most AURN sites in the UK, the vast majority met the PM 2.5 threshold. But we'll have another look on that. One question you might have is... Right, so Declan, you asked about the use of speed bands outside of England. And obviously, when we've developed this LA 105, we've obviously engaged with the devolved administrations for Wales, for Northern Ireland, for Scotland, and they are broadly supportive of the use of speed bands for scheme assessments, obviously where you're following the LA 105, so there's no restrictions there. PM 2.5 in Scotland, I mean, Transport Scotland have got a separate national application annex, and they do note within there to approach them before undertaking assessment. So I think in that example, Hazel, the point you raise, in your engagement with Transport Scotland in completing schemes on their behalf following LA 105, they would provide further clarity on that issue around PM 2.5. And I think that's all the comments. Have we got any more for any more?
I think that's it, Andy. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, I think, Hannah, as ever, if anybody has any comments after the event, they could drop you an email or send.
Well, if you could email the environment@highwaysengland.co.uk, that would be terrific.
I wasn't suggesting for a minute that you were inundated with emails.
I've had one or two. Okay, so thank you, everybody. This is the last discussion or last lunchtime meeting on these DMRB presentations. So they have all been recorded. They will be made available, and the answers will be published. And we'll get them out to you as soon as possible. But I will let you all know. Okay, thank you very much.
No, thank you.